The hum of the first-class cabin carried a comforting sense of calm, interrupted only by the occasional clink of glasses and murmur of polite conversation. Shaquille O'Neal, larger than life in every sense, settled into his oversized seat, engrossed in a book. His presence, as always, commanded attention, but he exuded a quiet, unbothered aura that made it clear he wasn't seeking it. A middle-aged man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, his gaze lingering too long on Shaq. The man's stiff demeanor betrayed irritation, and his muttering soon turned audible. "Guess they had to reinforce the plane for him," he scoffed, loud enough to draw glances from the surrounding passengers. Shaq didn't look up. A flicker of amusement passed over his face as he turned a page in his book. The man, emboldened by the lack of response, leaned toward his companion, amplifying his voice. "Probably paid for 2 seats," he added with a smug laugh, his tone dripping with condescension. Several passengers exchanged uneasy looks, some clearly embarrassed by the man's comments. The flight attendants, maintaining their professionalism, avoided direct acknowledgement. The tension simmered, but Shaq remained silent, seemingly unfazed. Then, with perfect timing and a voice as deep as the ocean, Shaq broke his silence. Without lifting his eyes from the book, he quipped, "Nah, they just let me sit in your ego's seat. It's roomy enough for both of us." The cabin erupted in laughter. The man's smirk vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by an awkward, flushed expression. His companion coughed, pretending to focus on his tablet, clearly unwilling to participate further. Shaq's demeanor didn't change. He was calm, collected, and entirely in control of the moment. His response had been light-hearted, but its precision had disarmed the man completely. The balance of power in the room had shifted without a single note of anger or aggression. Passengers began whispering among themselves, their glances toward Shaq now tinged with admiration. A young boy seated a few rows back tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly. "Mom, that's Shaq! He's so cool!" The man, still visibly flustered, crossed his arms and leaned back in his seat, muttering something under his breath. His discomfort was palpable, and it became clear that his attempt to belittle Shaq had only succeeded in embarrassing himself. Shaq glanced up briefly, catching the eye of a flight attendant who smiled at him appreciatively. "Anything else I can get you, Mr. O'Neal?" she asked warmly. He shook his head, offering her a polite smile before returning to his book. The flight carried on, but the mood in the cabin had shifted. Shaq's brief yet impactful response had turned an uncomfortable situation into a moment of levity, leaving no room for further negativity. While most passengers resumed their activities, a few continued to steal glances at the man, their expressions a mix of amusement and quiet judgment. As for Shaq, he remained unbothered, radiating an air of resilience and dignity that seemed to envelop him like a shield. He hadn't needed to escalate the situation or meet hostility with hostility. Instead, he had diffused it with humor and grace, leaving an indelible impression on everyone who witnessed it. And for the man who had tried to provoke him, the lesson was clear: sometimes, the loudest voices are silenced not with rage, but with wit and composure. Shaq's quip lingered in the air, a subtle reminder of his ability to turn a hostile moment into something disarmingly humorous. The man across the aisle, now clearly uncomfortable, shuffled in his seat. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a quiet simmer of embarrassment. The cabin was no longer on edge, though. Shaq's light-hearted wit had shifted the dynamic entirely. But the man wasn't finished. Perhaps driven by the sting of humiliation or an unwillingness to let things rest, he attempted to reassert himself. "I guess comedians can make it big these days," he said with a forced laugh, his voice less confident now. Shaq looked up this time, his expression unreadable, and tilted his head as though considering the comment. Then, with perfect delivery, he said, "And some people make it big just by being small-minded. Guess we all have our talents." Laughter rippled through the cabin again, louder this time. A businessman nearby chuckled openly, while a woman 2 rows ahead let out an audible, "That's good." Even a flight attendant passing through smiled, suppressing a laugh as she pretended to adjust her tray. The man's face reddened further, his discomfort now fully exposed. He attempted to busy himself with the in-flight magazine, flipping through it with exaggerated focus. His companion avoided eye contact, clearly regretting being seated next to him. Shaq didn't press further. He leaned back in his seat, picking up his book once more, as if the entire exchange was nothing more than a minor interruption. His composure stood in stark contrast to the man's agitation, a silent declaration of who held the upper hand. The atmosphere in the cabin lightened considerably. Conversations resumed, though snippets of Shaq's clever retort were still whispered here and there. A man in the row behind leaned forward and said, "You've got a future in stand-up, big guy." Shaq chuckled softly but didn't respond, content to let the moment pass. Meanwhile, the man across the aisle seemed to shrink into his seat. The initial confidence with which he had hurled his remarks was gone, replaced by a subdued unease. He glanced at Shaq occasionally, as if expecting retaliation, but Shaq gave him no further attention. What struck the passengers most wasn't just Shaq's quick wit, it was the way he handled the situation with an air of effortless grace. There was no malice in his words, no desire to humiliate or hurt. Instead, he wielded humor like a scalpel, cutting through prejudice with precision and leaving no room for escalation. A young woman seated a few rows back took out her phone and began typing furiously, likely tweeting about what she had just witnessed. It wasn't every day you saw a global icon handle discrimination with such finesse. Shaq's ability to turn the man's negativity into a moment of levity didn't just entertain, it sent a message. Those who had been silent observers now felt emboldened, their respect for him deepened. The man, for all his earlier bluster, had inadvertently become the butt of his own joke. By the time the flight attendants came through with refreshments, the mood in the cabin had transformed. Passengers who had initially felt awkward or tense were now smiling and chatting. Even those who hadn't interacted directly with Shaq felt uplifted, as though his calm confidence had rippled outward, touching everyone on board. As the man sat quietly, seemingly at a loss for how to recover, it became clear that his attempt to belittle Shaq had backfired entirely. Shaq, meanwhile, remained the embodiment of poise, having defused the situation without a single raised voice or angry word. In the small, self-contained world of the first-class cabin, the message was unmistakable. Prejudice might speak loudly, but dignity speaks louder. And in this case, dignity had the last laugh. The flight continued, and though the man across the aisle had grown silent, the earlier tension lingered faintly, like an unfinished chord. Shaq, still engrossed in his book, seemed oblivious, but his measured demeanor only heightened the intrigue surrounding him. It was clear the other passengers weren't done processing what had just happened. A woman seated nearby leaned toward Shaq, her voice low but audible enough for those closest to hear. "That was something else," she said, smiling warmly. "You handled that beautifully." Shaq glanced up, offered a polite nod, and replied with a grin. "Sometimes you just let people talk themselves into a corner. Saves you the effort." Her smile widened, and she leaned back, clearly impressed. Others who had overheard exchanged knowing looks. It wasn't just what Shaq said, it was the way he carried himself that left an impression. Meanwhile, the man across the aisle fidgeted, his discomfort palpable. He seemed torn between maintaining his silence and attempting to regain some semblance of control over the situation. Finally, he cleared his throat, his tones softer than before. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he began, addressing Shaq directly. "Just trying to make a joke, that's all." Shaq set his book down and regarded the man for a moment, his expression neutral. Then he said, "The thing about jokes? They're only funny if everyone's laughing. Maybe think about that next time." The man opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, unsure of what to say. The simplicity of Shaq's statement left no room for argument, and the other passengers murmured their agreement. It wasn't confrontational, it was factual, delivered with an authority that made it clear the conversation was over. As the man retreated further into his seat, Shaq resumed reading, but the atmosphere around him continued to shift. Passengers who might otherwise have hesitated to approach him now felt a newfound respect, drawn not just by his celebrity, but by his character. A flight attendant appeared with a tray of drinks, her smile directed at Shaq. "On the house, Mr. O'Neill," she said, setting down a glass. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "Appreciate it, but you don't have to do that. I'm good." Her admiration was evident as she nodded and moved on, the interaction only adding to the quiet reverence surrounding him. Across the aisle, the man's unease deepened. It wasn't just Shaq's response that had disarmed him. It was the unanimous support Shaq had garnered from everyone around them. For someone who had entered the cabin with an air of superiority, the shift in power was undeniable. He glanced at Shaq again, his expression now tinged with regret. "I guess I owe you an apology," he said hesitantly. Shaq looked up, his gaze steady. "You don't owe me anything," he said evenly. "But if you're serious about changing, maybe think about who you owe it to." The man seemed taken aback, his brow furrowing as he processed the words. It was a simple statement, but it carried weight, leaving no room for superficiality. The surrounding passengers, though silent, were clearly following the exchange, their attention fixed on the man. The weight of accountability was no longer something he could ignore. Shaq's words hung in the air as he returned to his book, effectively ending the conversation. The man sat back, his expression contemplative. For the first time, it seemed, he was genuinely reflecting on his actions. The cabin grew quiet once more, but the energy had shifted yet again. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had evolved into something far more meaningful. Shaq's calm leadership and refusal to engage in hostility had transformed the situation, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. And as the flight carried on, it was clear the man wasn't the only one who had been affected. In their own ways, each passenger was left to ponder what they had witnessed, and the quiet power of dignity in the face of prejudice. As the hours passed, the hum of the engines became the background score to a first-class cabin now cloaked in a reflective calm. Most passengers had settled into their routines, some watching in-flight movies, others lost in conversation or dozing off. Yet the earlier incident lingered in the air, a silent echo that hadn't fully dissipated. Shaq, still flipping through his book, occasionally paused to stretch or glance around the cabin. His ease was palpable, as though the earlier tension hadn't grazed him. But then, a tap on his shoulder brought his attention to the young woman from earlier, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Sorry to bother you," she began hesitantly. "But how do you stay so calm? I mean, after what happened?" Shaq chuckled lightly, closing his book. "You don't let other people's storms become your storm," he said simply. "If someone throws you a hot potato, you don't have to catch it." The metaphor landed, and she nodded thoughtfully, clearly taking it to heart. A few other passengers nearby subtly leaned in, clearly intrigued by his words. "You see," Shaq continued, his tone conversational but firm, "people like that? They're just testing boundaries. The moment you give them power over you, you've already lost. It's not about them, it's about how you decide to carry yourself." The woman smiled, visibly inspired. She thanked him and returned to her seat, but her interaction with Shaq had drawn even more attention. Nearby, a businessman wearing a tailored suit turned toward Shaq with a curious look. "You've got quite the perspective," the man said, his voice tinged with admiration. "I think a lot of us could learn from that." Shaq raised an eyebrow, smiling faintly. "It's not rocket science," he replied. "We all have a choice. You can either let people pull you down or rise above it. I choose to rise." The businessman nodded, visibly impressed. "A lot of people don't see it that way, though," he said. "They will," Shaq said, his voice steady. "Sometimes it just takes a moment to show them what's possible." Across the aisle, the man who had sparked the earlier conflict shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Though he kept his gaze averted, it was clear he was listening intently. The indirect lessons Shaq was sharing seemed to land harder than any direct confrontation could have. As the conversation drifted, the cabin attendants came by again, this time offering snacks and drinks. The atmosphere, which had once been strained, now felt lighter, a reflection of the calm influence Shaq had brought to the space. The older man, who had stayed silent since his half-hearted apology, finally mustered the courage to speak again. "Mr. O'Neill," he began, his tone tentative, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About how jokes should make everyone laugh." Shaq turned toward him, his expression patient but unreadable. "I didn't realize how it sounded," the man admitted, his voice faltering slightly. "I guess I thought I was being clever. But looking back, it wasn't right." Shaq studied him for a moment, his silence amplifying the man's unease. Then, he nodded slowly. "Acknowledging it is a start," he said. "But words only go so far. What matters is what you do next." The man swallowed hard, his discomfort now a full-fledged reckoning. The simplicity of Shaq's statement hit him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. Other passengers exchanged quiet glances, impressed by Shaq's measured approach. He wasn't letting the man off the hook, but he wasn't dragging him down, either. It was accountability without malice, a rare balance that only someone with true confidence could achieve. The rest of the cabin seemed to take note, too. Conversations resumed, but there was an undertone of thoughtfulness in the air. Shaq's ability to lead by example had turned what could have been an ugly incident into a moment of collective growth. As Shaq settled back into his seat, the man across the aisle sank into quiet contemplation. Whatever he was wrestling with, it was clear he wouldn't leave the flight the same person he'd boarded as. The impact of Shaq's calm leadership rippled outward, leaving everyone to reflect on their own actions, their own choices. And as the plane soared through the skies, it carried more than just passengers. It carried the weight of a lesson in dignity, one that no one on board would soon forget. The final leg of the flight stretched on, but the earlier events were still fresh in everyone's mind. As Shaq leaned back in his seat, the hum of the airplane felt different now. There was an undercurrent of reflection that had replaced the tension from before. Most passengers had quietly absorbed the lessons, whether they acknowledged them openly or not. The man across the aisle, who had initially sparked the confrontation, seemed to shrink further into himself. His earlier bravado had dissolved, leaving behind a man visibly unsure of himself. The hard edges of his earlier comments had softened, replaced by a quiet introspection. He glanced at Shaq, but when their eyes met, he quickly looked away, perhaps too ashamed to face him directly. For the first time since boarding, the cabin felt like a space where understanding could take root, where accountability wasn't just a passing word but something that lingered in the air. It was as though Shaq had laid down a challenge, not just to the man who had made the insult but to everyone present. Shaq's ability to command the room had been subtle but undeniable. His power wasn't in his size, his celebrity, or even his humor. It was in his unwavering commitment to dignity, and to letting actions speak louder than words. And as much as the man across the aisle had faltered, there was a shift in the atmosphere around him. A young man sitting a few rows back leaned over to his companion. "You know," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've never really thought about it like that. I mean, people always say don't let it bother you, but he's not just talking about the situation. He's talking about life. Just how you deal with things in general." His friend nodded, his gaze fixed on Shaq. "Yeah, it's like he's teaching us how to handle adversity with grace. We've all seen people snap under pressure. But he didn't, and he didn't even raise his voice. It's kind of impressive." The first man smiled slightly. "You think we could do the same? In our own lives, I mean." The second man paused, then shrugged. "I don't know, but it's something to think about. I think I'll try." As the exchange continued, Shaq sat with quiet contentment. He wasn't engaged in the conversation, but it was clear he was the catalyst behind it. The subtlety of his influence had not only diffused a potentially dangerous situation but had now set in motion a ripple of introspection among the passengers. Meanwhile, the man who had started it all, whose arrogance had once seemed so impenetrable, now found himself weighed down by the realization of his own ignorance. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his position as if trying to find comfort in an unfamiliar space. He finally took a deep breath and, with no more fanfare than a simple gesture, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "I'm going to the restroom," he muttered, almost apologetically. As he passed by Shaq's seat, he hesitated for a moment, then looked down. "I really do owe you an apology," he said, his voice lower than it had been before. "I don't know what came over me. It wasn't right." Shaq glanced up, his gaze steady but kind. "I appreciate that," he replied simply. "But it's not about me. It's about how you treat people from now on. That's where it counts." The man nodded, his eyes reflecting an unspoken understanding, and then walked down the aisle, disappearing into the restroom. There was no dramatic exchange, no cathartic release, just a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had passed and a new one had begun. Shaq returned to his book, his expression unreadable, but the impact of his words lingered in the cabin. No one would mistake this for a victory. It wasn't about defeating an adversary. It was about leadership, about the quiet act of holding space for growth without demanding anything in return. The flight continued its journey through the skies, and the conversations around Shaq began to pick up once more, but now there was a different energy to the cabin. Even the man who had once mocked Shaq was being transformed by the experience, though it was a transformation that could only be measured in small shifts. In the back of the cabin, a group of passengers began talking about the power of words and actions, discussing how they could apply the principles of empathy and understanding to their own lives. The more Shaq spoke with his calm presence, the more the collective mood shifted from one of discomfort to one of solidarity. The flight attendants, too, noticed the change. What had started as a tense, almost divisive situation had evolved into something more harmonious. As they made their rounds, offering drinks and snacks, they exchanged smiles with the passengers, no longer simply going through the motions of their job but reflecting the change in the atmosphere. It wasn't a grand transformation, not by any means. But it was enough. Enough to make everyone consider how they could do better, how they could be more mindful of their words, of their actions, and of the way they treated others. Shaq had given them that. Without effort, without drama, just by showing up as himself. And in that quiet, unspoken way, Shaq had made a lasting impact. The man who had once insulted him was no longer the center of attention. It was no longer about the insult at all. It was about how everyone, each individual on that plane, could rise above the pettiness of the moment and choose to act with dignity and understanding instead. By the time the plane began its descent, the entire cabin had undergone a subtle but profound shift. It wasn't just the people who had witnessed the incident who had changed. The very air itself seemed different. There was a quiet hope, a collective desire for better, that had taken root. Shaq's simple act of turning the other cheek had sparked something far greater than any confrontation could have. As the plane began its descent, the once tense atmosphere had noticeably shifted. What had started as an uncomfortable encounter was now marked by an unspoken sense of transformation. The passengers, who had once watched the situation unfold with varying degrees of discomfort, now seemed at ease, even thoughtful. It was as though they had all collectively learned a lesson without realizing it was happening. Shaq continued to sit quietly, his demeanor unchanged, but there was a noticeable difference in how others interacted with him. There was a newfound respect in the air, an understanding that had been forged through the unexpected moments of the flight. What had initially seemed like a fleeting incident was now something that carried weight, and Shaq's role in it was undeniable. The man who had instigated the conflict, now seated quietly a few rows away, hadn't said much since his awkward attempt at an apology. He had retreated into himself, visibly struggling with the weight of his own actions. He hadn't expected the situation to unfold this way, but he now found himself confronted by the reality of his behavior and the silent judgment of the passengers around him. One of the flight attendants, who had observed the entire interaction from the sidelines, approached Shaq as she made her rounds. "You handled that with a lot of grace," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of admiration and gratitude. "I don't think many people would have stayed so calm in the face of that." Shaq smiled at her, a small, knowing smile. "It's all about letting go of the things that don't matter," he replied simply. "People have their issues, but that's not mine to carry." She nodded thoughtfully, her expression softening as she walked away. The words Shaq had shared were simple, but their impact resonated deeper than most people realized. As she moved through the cabin, she noticed that many of the passengers seemed to be lost in thought, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. It wasn't just about the man who had mocked Shaq, it was about the way everyone had been given an opportunity to reassess their own actions, their own biases, and how they carried themselves in the world. The man across the aisle, the one who had started it all, remained silent, but his posture had changed. He no longer sat upright in defiance but had slumped slightly, as if carrying the weight of a lesson he hadn't expected to learn. His earlier bravado had dissolved, replaced by the quiet discomfort of self-awareness. He avoided eye contact with the others, though it was clear that the passengers had subtly shifted their stance toward him. No one had overtly criticized him, but there was an undercurrent of quiet judgment that spoke volumes. At the same time, some of the passengers who had initially been uncomfortable with the whole situation began engaging in quieter, more meaningful conversations. One woman, sitting near the front of the cabin, turned to her seatmate and began discussing the power of words, how they could either uplift or tear people down. Another passenger, a man who had been sitting in the aisle seat, leaned over to his companion and muttered, "I never thought about it that way. I've always heard the saying, sticks and stones, but it really does matter how we treat people." The tone of the cabin had transformed completely. Conversations weren't filled with nervous chatter anymore, but with genuine reflections on respect, dignity, and the power of empathy. And even though Shaq hadn't explicitly sought to be a teacher, his quiet strength and his calm demeanor had inadvertently sparked this shift. The flight attendant's rounds continued, and she couldn't help but notice that people were beginning to open up to each other in ways they hadn't before. One couple, who had been sitting silently during the earlier incident, now shared a conversation about how they could encourage more open dialogue on topics like race and privilege in their own community. A group of friends, who had been distractedly scrolling through their phones, started talking about their own experiences with prejudice, sharing stories of both hurt and growth. It was as though Shaq had unknowingly planted a seed in everyone's minds, one that made them question their own assumptions and biases. And now, in the final stretch of the flight, they were all collectively processing it. The man who had insulted Shaq had been the catalyst for this moment, but it was the collective openness of the passengers that allowed for change to happen. As the plane continued its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling the final approach to their destination. The flight attendants began preparing the cabin for landing, but the mood was markedly different. The earlier tension had all but vanished, replaced by an unspoken understanding that no one had to say a word about what had transpired. They just knew. The man who had made the derogatory comment now sat with his arms folded, looking out the window, lost in thought. He hadn't spoken to anyone since his brief apology to Shaq, and it was clear that the weight of the situation had left him in a reflective silence. He had, for the first time in a long while, been forced to confront his own prejudices and the impact they had on others. He wasn't proud of what he had done, but it was a humbling moment that would stay with him long after the flight had ended. And Shaq? He had long since returned to his book, his calm unaffected by the shifting dynamics around him. He didn't need to seek validation or acknowledgement from anyone. His quiet leadership had already done its work, and the cabin, in its own way, had become a better place for it. The descent was almost complete, and as the plane began to touch down, the hum of the engines signaling their arrival, the passengers slowly began preparing to disembark. But the atmosphere in the cabin felt different. There was a sense of unity, a shared understanding that hadn't existed before. It wasn't something that could be quantified or neatly wrapped up in a tidy bow, but it was there, a subtle, powerful shift that would ripple out into the world long after they had left the plane. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Shaq gathered his things, preparing to leave. He didn't expect anyone to say anything to him, and that was fine. He had done what he came to do. He had set an example of grace, dignity, and the power of restraint, and in doing so, had shown everyone that it was possible to rise above ignorance and respond with empathy and understanding. The flight had ended, but the journey for those on board had only just begun. As the aircraft slowed to a stop at the gate, a palpable shift in the energy of the cabin remained. The earlier tension had dissolved, but something much more significant had replaced it. The passengers filed toward the door, but there was an unspoken connection between them now. It was as if they had all been part of something much larger than the brief altercation that had taken place mid-flight. Shaq stood from his seat, adjusting his belongings with the casual grace that he was known for. He wasn't looking for recognition, but there was no denying the effect his composure had had on those around him. Some passengers nodded in his direction as they passed by, their gestures subtle but filled with silent respect. Others made eye contact, offering an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that spoke volumes more than words ever could. There were no overt praises or acknowledgements, but there was a quiet understanding of what had transpired. It was a moment of personal growth for many, brought about by something as simple as a sharp exchange of words, followed by an even sharper response from Shaq. The man who had started the confrontation, still seated a few rows behind, remained silent as the other passengers made their way off the plane. He avoided eye contact with anyone, his posture hunched forward as though trying to shrink into himself. His earlier bravado had long since evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable self-awareness. He was now left alone with his thoughts, the echoes of the incident replaying in his mind. His own actions had not only embarrassed him in front of the passengers but had also revealed to him the ignorance he had carried with him for so long. He hadn't expected the encounter to unfold as it had. In his mind, he had hoped to get away with a brief moment of discomfort, but what had happened instead was a deep, unexpected reflection. Shaq, unaffected by the silent gestures of respect, moved toward the door of the plane, blending into the flow of passengers. He hadn't expected anyone to make a fuss over his handling of the situation, nor was he interested in making a spectacle of it. His role had been to serve as a catalyst for change, a quiet force that had shifted the atmosphere. But now it was time for everyone to go back to their lives. He had done what he needed to do, and now it was up to the passengers to carry the weight of what they had learned. But as Shaq neared the exit, the man who had mocked him earlier suddenly stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though weighing every step. He approached Shaq carefully, his eyes downcast, unable to meet Shaq's gaze. For a moment, the two men stood there in silence, the energy between them charged with an unspoken tension. I just wanted to apologize, the man said, his voice low and hesitant. It was clear that he was struggling to find the right words. What I said, that wasn't right. Shaq turned to face him, his expression calm, as always. There was no animosity in his demeanor, only a quiet understanding that the apology, though awkward, was necessary for both of them. Shaq nodded slowly, as though acknowledging the weight of the moment. It's all right, Shaq said with a slight smile. We all make mistakes. The man seemed taken aback by Shaq's response, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. There was a sense of relief in his posture, though it was clear that the apology hadn't erased the tension completely. The words had been spoken, but the real work of personal reflection and growth was far from over. I didn't mean to insult you, the man continued, now lifting his gaze to meet Shaq's, though there was still an undercurrent of discomfort in his eyes. It was a stupid thing to say. I've been dealing with some personal stuff, and I guess I took it out on you. Shaq, listening intently, nodded again. He didn't feel the need to probe further, to dig into the man's reasoning. It wasn't his place to understand every nuance of the other man's life. What mattered was that he had come forward, taking the first step toward redemption. You don't have to explain, Shaq replied with a calm that seemed to put the man at ease. But it's good that you realize what you said wasn't right. The man hesitated for a moment, and then, in a gesture that seemed both awkward and genuine, extended his hand toward Shaq. It was a tentative offer of peace, an attempt to close the gap that had been created by his earlier words. Shaq looked at the hand for a moment, and without hesitation, shook it firmly. Thanks, the man said, his voice a bit steadier now. I needed that. Shaq nodded, offering a final smile. Take care of yourself, he said quietly before turning to leave. The brief exchange was enough to set things in motion, but it wasn't the end of the story. As Shaq stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, he didn't feel like he had completed some grand task or performed an act of heroism. In his mind, the real work wasn't about making some dramatic statement, it was about the quiet way he had responded, choosing not to react in anger or frustration but instead with dignity and compassion. Inside the terminal, passengers began to disperse in their own directions, some heading to baggage claim, others to connecting flights. But the events of the flight had left a subtle mark on them all. It was clear that the brief interaction had sparked something deeper in many of them, something that went beyond the confines of the plane. The reflection on discrimination, the understanding of how prejudice could manifest, and the importance of empathy and forgiveness had already begun to take root. As the man who had insulted Shaq made his way through the airport, he noticed the shift in his own mindset. He hadn't expected the incident to affect him so profoundly, but it had. It was as if, in that brief moment of humility, he had been given a second chance. His actions hadn't just embarrassed him, they had forced him to reconsider how he approached others, how he allowed his biases to shape his interactions. And though he couldn't undo what had been said, he knew that he had the power to move forward with a new understanding, one that had been ignited in a moment of discomfort and propelled forward by the grace of someone who had chosen not to retaliate. In the end, it wasn't just Shaq's actions that had made a difference, it was the impact of that moment on everyone who had witnessed it. The apology, the exchange, and the quiet acceptance were reminders of the power of vulnerability and the potential for growth, even in the most unexpected of situations. What had started as a simple flight had transformed into a pivotal moment for all involved, and while the man who had insulted Shaq would likely never forget the lesson he'd learned, it was clear that the true legacy of the moment was not in his apology, but in the quiet ripple of change that had been set into motion across the passengers and beyond. The days following the flight had a peculiar sense of weight, like the ripple of a stone thrown into a calm lake. Although the immediate aftermath of the encounter had settled, the effect of it lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. For Shaq, it was just another moment in a long series of interactions with the public, but for others, it was something far more significant, something that had changed how they viewed the world, and perhaps even how they saw themselves. The man who had insulted Shaq found himself in a deep, reflective state. His apology had been necessary, but it had only scratched the surface of a much deeper issue within himself. The encounter had forced him to face the truth about his own prejudices, something he had avoided for years. In the days after the flight, he found himself replaying the exchange over and over, and with each replay, he saw more clearly how his words had been rooted in ignorance, in the weight of stereotypes he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He had never been forced to confront them before, and now that he had, there was no going back. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself that it was just a misunderstanding, that it wasn't such a big deal. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He had felt the sting of humiliation, but that was nothing compared to the uncomfortable truth that had settled in his chest. He had been wrong. He knew it now. And as the days passed, he couldn't shake the sense that this moment, this brief exchange with Shaq, had presented him with an opportunity he hadn't expected, the chance to evolve. He started small. A simple decision to educate himself more on issues of racism, discrimination, and prejudice. He read books, watched documentaries, and listened to people's stories. The more he learned, the more he realized just how much he had been unaware of. His privilege had shielded him from understanding the struggles of others, and he had taken that for granted. But now, he couldn't ignore it. He had seen firsthand the damage that words could cause, and he wanted to do better. It wasn't easy. He made mistakes along the way. He stumbled through conversations with friends and family, trying to express his newfound understanding without fully knowing how to articulate it. But he persisted. He sought out mentorship from those who had experienced prejudice and racism directly, listening to their stories and learning from their experiences. Slowly but surely, his worldview began to shift. His old, biased thinking started to unravel, replaced by a growing sense of empathy. He had begun to see the world through a different lens, one that was more aware, more compassionate. As he continued his journey of self-improvement, he couldn't help but think back to Shaq. The way Shaq had handled the situation had left an indelible impression on him. Rather than lash out, Shaq had chosen to respond with grace, with humor, and with a quiet authority that had commanded respect. He had been calm in the face of mockery, using his position of strength not to overpower the other man, but to uplift those around him. Shaq had shown him a better way to handle conflict, a way that didn't involve perpetuating harm, but instead aimed at healing. That moment had been a turning point for him, and although he hadn't yet fully processed its significance, he knew it was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Shaq continued his life, moving on from the flight without dwelling too much on what had happened. He had long been accustomed to being the target of jokes, mockery, and prejudice, but that had never defined him. His humor, his kindness, and his ability to remain above the fray were what made him who he was. It wasn't about getting revenge or making a grand statement. It was about living his life authentically, without letting the ignorance of others affect his peace of mind. Despite this, Shaq couldn't ignore the impact that moment had had. He began to notice small changes in the way people interacted with him. There were more smiles, more handshakes, more moments of recognition. It wasn't just about fame or status, it was about respect. People were beginning to understand that his worth wasn't defined by his size, his wealth, or his celebrity status. It was defined by the way he treated others, by his ability to inspire with humor, with empathy, and with strength. He wasn't just a towering figure on a basketball court. He was a man who stood up for dignity and humanity. In the weeks that followed, the story of the flight continued to make its rounds in various circles. It became a topic of conversation in online forums, social media, and even news outlets. People praised Shaq for handling the situation with such grace, calling it a perfect example of how to respond to ignorance with kindness. Many pointed out the power of humor in diffusing tense situations, highlighting how Shaq's witty remarks had turned a moment of humiliation into a moment of collective unity. For the man who had insulted Shaq, it was a different kind of attention. He was bombarded with messages, some supportive, some critical, urging him to take responsibility for his actions. Some encouraged him to continue his journey of self-awareness and growth, while others didn't hold back in expressing their disappointment. It was a complicated mix of feedback, but it was exactly what he needed. He had never been confronted with such a direct response to his behavior before, and it forced him to confront not only his actions but also the impact they had on others. The public scrutiny didn't deter him. Instead, it served as a catalyst for further change. He used the attention to amplify his commitment to being better, to fostering an environment where people felt seen, heard, and respected. He began advocating for diversity and inclusion within his company, using his platform to address the very issues he had once been ignorant about. As the months went on, both men found themselves on different paths of growth, but their lives had been connected in a way that neither of them could have predicted. Shaq had inspired change with his simple act of standing up to ignorance, while the other man had been forced to confront his own biases and begin the long process of redemption. The encounter had been small, fleeting even, but its impact was far-reaching. It had set into motion a series of events that would continue to unfold in ways either of them could have foreseen. In the end, it wasn't about a single confrontation, but about the ripple effect of compassion, understanding, and the willingness to change. Shaq had shown that heroism didn't always come in the form of grand gestures. Sometimes, it was in the quiet moments, the responses to adversity that led to transformation. And for the man who had insulted him, the journey toward redemption was just beginning, but he knew it was one worth taking. He had learned that change was not only possible but necessary, and it was up to him to take the next step.